Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
Death is not an easy subject to talk about, but it's a fact of life. We will all die someday, and between now and then, we'll have family and friends who will die. So how can we help those close to us who are facing death, and how can we best prepare for our own lives to end?
We'll explore those questions on this episode with Dr. B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger, who are the co-authors of the book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. It's described as the first ever practical, compassionate, and comprehensive guide to dying and living fully until you do.
Dr. Miller is an assistant clinical professor of medicine at the University of California at San Francisco, where he practices and teaches palliative medicine. He has his own serious brush with death to talk about as well because of an accident that occurred when he was in college. It resulted in the amputation of one arm below the elbow and both legs below the knees. Shoshana is the global editorial director at IDEO, where she has worked on end-of-life projects and was a caregiver during her father's 5-year decline with an incurable illness.
BJ and Shoshana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and why you guys decided to write this book together.
Shoshana and I met through a couple different angles working on this subject one way or another at IDEO, and we had a bunch of experiences together there, and we got to know each other a little bit and got to explore the subject pretty open-endedly. And when Shoshana brought up the idea of writing a book together, it was a pretty quick, easy yes, because I knew the world needed a book like this, and it felt right to work with Shoshana on it, both because just the way we are together, but also the idea that one of us is a clinician, the other is not, and it seemed important to have a foot in healthcare and one big foot outside of it, too. So altogether, that's what kind of encouraged me to say yes to this project.
And Shoshana, why did you feel such a project was needed?
I had a personal reason to start, which is I wrote this book because my father and stepfather died within a year of each other, one with dementia and the other with cancer. And I was involuntarily enrolled in a crash course in illness and death. And other than showing up, I really had no idea how to be a good caregiver, how to help them navigate healthcare and insurance, or even what questions to ask them about what they wanted their remaining lives to look like, which is a really sensitive and delicate question. I'm also a mom, and when I was pregnant, I, like everyone else in the world, read What to Expect When You're Expecting, that Bible of pregnancy for expectant families. It sold like 500 million copies.
Sure.
And it walks you through this huge life experience, and I thought, why don't we have a guidebook for this equally profound time at the end of life? And then, of course, I met BJ, who had a really bold and beautiful vision for how we could use the fact that we die as a foil to help us make the lives that we have more meaningful. As a journalist and designer, BJ wrote this TED Talk, and I helped him with it. And then I said to him, I really wish this wasn't the case because I know how painful it is to write a book, but I think we have to write a book. And thankfully, he said yes.
We wanted to ask you, BJ, about that TED Talk, which has had more than 10 million views, and it was titled, What Really Matters at the End of Life. So what does really matter at the end of life? What have you found?
Well, interestingly, that by the way, that was not the title I suggested. It showed up there. And really, if I were going to do that again, I would put a question mark at the end of that because that's an extremely subjective question, and each of us needs to think of it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. But with that disclaimer, I can say that in general, most people I work with, and data bears this out across the field of hospice and palliative care, that most people, they want to know that the people they love are going to be okay. They want to have some sense that they're not going to suffer too much. They want to leave things in a good place for their family. And they want to know that their relationship to God and to the cosmos is in line. That's the kind of stuff. They're not very clinical goals in nature. They're much more sort of humanitarian goals. And that plays out all the time. I see that all over the place. That's generally how it goes.
What misconceptions do you think we have about death and dying?
Well, one of them is, I laugh just because it's going to sound absurd, but it's just kind of true. Like if you walked around the halls of a hospital in particular, Well, if you just drove around town and looked at billboards, et cetera. I mean, all the cues that we send each other, even in medicine, maybe even especially in medicine, would kind of leave you wondering if death was optional. Like if I follow the rules, if I'm a good person, if I think positive thoughts and eat spinach, then yeah, it sounds like I can live forever. And that is the kind of the presumption. It can be crazy making, even as a clinician in the hospital. The original title of the TED Talk was not whether, but how. Like, let's get past this kind of question of whether we die and get to the more important stuff, like how are we going to die and how are we going to live until we do? So to answer your question, the first misconception is just to clear up, yes, in fact, we do die, and we need to digest that and fold that into our sense of reality. Other than that sort of big existential frame, I think a lot of people presume that you just have to suffer, that death is necessarily awful and miserable making. And in fact, it is not generally easy, and we do not want to sugarcoat it or accidentally set people up to underplan for the end of life. But the idea is, yeah, there's going to be some heartache and there's going to be some hard stuff. But the idea that most of us picture this sort of brutal ending is just not necessarily the case. There's so much that can be done to push back on symptoms. And if you have enough support, you can get to honest, open conversations with people you love. And if you can't find closure, you can at least address the things on your mind and you can say your goodbyes, et cetera. So I guess in short, this misconception is dying does not have to be quite as miserable as we fear it to be.
There was a study done at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill that I thought was really interesting. And it said that the closer you are to dying, the more positive of an outlook you have on it. And I'm wondering why you guys think that is and what are the changes that occur in our mindset?
If you can think in your own life of where you've had something in the future that you know or you think is going to be hard, whether it's an exam or I don't know, whatever it is. And most of us will imagine that thing to be worse than it actually is when you're living it. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of the reason for this answer is that when you actually are in those shoes, I think people realize that their fears were misplaced and it's not as horrible as they were imagining. So I think that's one piece of it. But then another piece of it is what Shoshana and I found working on this book, and I see clinically, is that once you do turn your attention to your finite nature, the fact that you are only here for a certain amount of time, as Shosh said, that is an amazing foil for beauty, humor, all sorts of good things in life, quote unquote, good things in life to pop. They really stand out. And so if you realize there are only so many more weekends in your life, well, maybe you will use those weekends a little better. You'll be a little bit more thoughtful how you spend your time. Maybe you'll get a little bit better at letting go of things that aren't such a big deal. And maybe you'll get a little bit better at realizing that we're all in this boat together, and maybe you'll be a little kinder to yourself and to others, and maybe forgiveness will come a little more easy. So, in other words, turn your attention to your mortality. It's not the morose thing you think it's going to be. In fact, it often has a side effect of making life sweeter along the way.
Shoshana, you suggest that we have a When I Die file. That's one of the recommendations you have in the book. In fact, I think it's one of the first things that you talk about. What should be in that?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I think it's one of the most important pieces of advice we give in the book. And it's because, we just leave our families so unprepared to deal with the fallout of shutting down our lives after we go. And I dealt with this with my father's accounts and estate for, I'd say, 2 years after he died. So what should go in there is, of course, your will and trust. And if you haven't got those done and you have a family and some property and stuff like that, that's pretty essential, especially if you have kids, because one of the essential things you do in making up a trust is to identify who will take care of your kids if they're young and you pass away. So those things are essential. And then, of course, we accumulate millions of different passwords as we move through life now. So it's pretty essential to share the accounts you have in your passwords so that people know how to access your accounts and they don't have to do a ton of sleuthing. Anyone knows who's called their internet provider or cellular phone service, the pain and suffering of working through a million different phone trees to actually get to someone who can help you change the ownership of the account or shut down an account will convince you that you should do this. And then there's all of the stuff that is softer stuff that you may not think of, but that can be so meaningful to the people who loved you, which is, recipes that you loved and cooked all the time for the family, or a poem or a piece of artwork, or even a letter to the people you loved, just telling them what you wanted to say to them, what you hope that they'll carry forward. So there's a lot to put in there. You can read more in the book.
I'm in my 20s, and this whole topic is really difficult for me to think about, and I really haven't thought about it much. So when do you suggest that people start to create an advanced care plan and a will and funeral plans? When should that start?
Well, the honest truth is that the moment you turn 18 and are a legal adult, you should have an advanced healthcare directive. And I'll tell you the reason for that. When you turn 18, your parents or your loved ones no longer have access to your medical records because of HIPAA and privacy laws. So if something happens to you, they have no real right to ask about your medical records. So unless you have an advanced directive and say, this person is my healthcare agent and I want them to know, I want them to have access, they won't. So that's a really important thing to just get done when you turn 18, which I know feels early, but as our friend Shoshana Ungulator says, it always feels too early until it's too late. And then in terms of a will and trust, I think the natural life cycle moment for that is when you have a family of your own and you're thinking about who might be a good caretaker for your kids if you're not around, and how you and your partner are thinking about your own lives as you age and thinking about who you want to hand your stuff down to.
BJ, you've talked with so many people at the end of their lives, and I'm wondering what they shared with you about the things that they had to cope with in terms of telling family, friends, and coworkers that the end was near, and what advice you could pass on for other people along those lines.
Yeah, well, it's pretty darn common for that to be a hard conversation, less because the person who's actually doing the dying has hang-ups than everyone else has hang-ups. Mm-hmm. So very often that person will get shut down one way or another. Their family or friends will say, we don't need to think about that, or no, some way or another they'll find some way to squirm out of it. And the crazy-making piece of it is usually the audience person will make the ill person, the dying person, feel like it can be really isolating. Like they'll make it sound like it's, they're trying to keep your attitude good. They're trying to encourage you. But it's really their own fears that you're coming up against. And that sort of projection, it happens all the time around vulnerability, disability, death, etc. Because this remains taboo, because we're unpracticed at it, we remain uncomfortable at it, we remain unexamined at it. And so we accidentally isolate the sick person with our own defenses. So I guess back to your question, I would be prepared to come across some sort of surprising responses in people. Mm-hmm. And my advice always with patients is be careful, because you can walk away from these conversations feeling crazy or sad yourself. Of course, be careful to not confuse their hang-ups with your own. So, in terms of coaching someone through that, you just have to be prepared to kind of push a little bit and make it clear that you, the dying person, wants to talk about this, or you, the sick person, wants to, or you, the well person, who just needs to prepare. Be prepared for projections and be prepared to push a little bit. And you, ostensibly the vulnerable one, are going to end up being the one who's counseling others who are less comfortable than you.
Being with someone on their deathbed, I think, is just such a tremendous gift. And it's just unlike anything else that you experience in life. As I mentioned, when my own mother died, we didn't have a lot of time left with her. She became suddenly very ill. And I was quickly looking on the internet for what do you need to know with someone who's on their deathbed. And obviously, if your book had been around in 2011 when I was confronted with this, I could have looked at that. But what are some of the things that you would say to help prepare someone for being with someone on their deathbed? One of the things that I heard is that, for example, the person's hearing is the last thing to go, so that even if they seem to be completely out of it, they may still be able to hear you. What advice would you have for us along those lines?
Well, BJ, I would love for you to build on this, but I'll just quickly add that, yes, it feels like hearing is such an important sense at the end. They do say all of the other senses shut down, but then the idea that you can whisper into your loved one's ear some parting words and that they'll hear that and take that away with them as they go is incredibly powerful. I remember doing that with my dad and just stroking his head and whispering in his ear. And I've also heard many, many times from the people who we interviewed for this book that oftentimes their loved one wouldn't die and kept holding on until they actually left the room. And it's a pretty common experience that, you're holding vigil and you're, not sleeping and eating and you're just sitting by the bedside hoping that you'll be there for that moment. And the minute you take a pee break, your loved one dies. And there's something psychologically that I think happens where, the loved one who's dying is aware that they can't do it in front of you. And they almost need you to leave the room to let go. So there's something really profound there. And BJ, I'm sure you have more to add.
Yeah, that last point's really, really key, because otherwise it honestly feels like cruel. I mean, you see folks like not sleep for days on end and finally not off or go to the bathroom or whatever it is. And unless they're aware of this phenomenon, it almost feels cruel. So understanding that and understanding, therefore, that the kindest thing you can do is take care of yourself. Go to the bathroom when you need to. Go outside. And when you step away, just give your loved one a kiss and let them know that you're going to be okay. And that may be the end. And so in a way, sometimes leaving the bedside can be the kindest thing. So that's a huge point. And then the second one this reminds me of is it's really important to understand that delirium is very common at the end of life. So in the final hours to days, the person very often is asleep, but sometimes awake and maybe totally disoriented. Delirium is a sort of a condition of disorientation where time and space are off. And you almost get the feeling that someone's kind of crossing over back and forth, like they're in and out of this reality and in and out of a different reality. And so one thing to note is that delirium is a thing. It happened. But most importantly is for the loved ones to realize that when someone's delirious, it's not them talking. So I remember clearly, and it's come up several times, but there was a particularly dramatic moment where I was at a public venue giving a talk, and a woman asked a question at the end of the talk, and you could tell she was so scarred and practically shaking and relaying the final moments of her husband's life. Her husband apparently had been totally devoted, the sweetest man on the planet, had never uttered an unkind word to her, except in the final things he ever said to her were apparently just completely horrible and crass and out of character. And because the widow did not know about delirium, she took her husband totally literally. And her grief was so compounded because she had to wonder, what secret life, what secret feelings did her husband have all these years, and was beating herself up over it. And the answer was so simple. It wasn't him talking. That was delirium talking. So that's a huge, huge consequential realization.
So much of the fear surrounding death is the fact that we don't really know what to expect. And for people who haven't had experience with a loved one passing away in hospice care or in a hospital, if they've been lucky enough not to lose someone, but they're just scared in general of dying, what advice would you have to them in terms of if it's painful or if there's suffering involved or how they could get relief during that time?
Well, one thing to know is that there is a whole field, hospice and palliative medicine, dedicated to helping people not suffer. So there's a whole discipline, a whole team waiting for you in a palliative care team, or if you're really at the end of life, it's generally hospice. And so don't wait. So hospice has a lot of connotations. Some people honestly believe that hospice is a place that actually kills you, that takes your life. That is just not true. But for all sorts of reasons, people put off the call to palliative care or put off the call to hospice until it's way late in the game. and they've suffered way more than they need to. In fact, we have data, more and more data suggests that hospice and palliative medicine don't hasten your death, and if anything, they help you live longer because they de-stress you, help control your symptoms, support you and your family, et cetera. So I guess a big takeaway there is you don't need to, this does not have to be so hard. I would not wait to call hospice. If you call hospice and you end up living for months and years, great. You can come off hospice, you'll get your old insurance back, nothing is lost. So when in doubt, call in the professionals to help support you.
And what's the difference between palliative care and hospice care?
Ooh, thanks for asking that. Yeah, so the field is called hospice and palliative medicine. That is the official title of this subspecialty, this medical subspecialty. But there's a big distinction between the two. And palliative care, it grew out of hospice, which is sort of basically interdisciplinary work to help people to suffer less and find more meaning, to mitigate suffering and make life more meaningful until you die. And hospice is palliative care reserved for the end of life. But the definition of palliative care is just the interdisciplinary pursuit of meaning and the mitigation of suffering. And there's no mention in the definition of palliative care of time until death. So the huge distinction is there. You do not need to be dying anytime soon to get palliative care. I practice in a palliative care clinic at UCSF, and I have patients that I've been seeing for a dozen years. So palliative care, all hospice is palliative care, but not all palliative care is hospice. Hospice is palliative care reserved for the end of life, but otherwise palliative care has no investment in you dying anytime soon.
As you guys know, our show is called Nobody Told Me, and we want to hear from both of you. What are your Nobody Told Me lessons about dying that you'd like to pass on?
I wish somebody had told me that it's really important for us to just talk openly about death, even if it's hard, because there's really a lot we can do to be the designers of our own endings. And, you know, we don't know how we'll die, and the circumstances may not yield us much control over that. But there's actually a lot we can do to lean into it. And having a conversation with the people we love about what we want and don't want as we age and die is so, so important. So, you know, think through people in your life who have died and think about what about that experience you would want for yourself and what maybe you would want to do differently. And I've started to do that with my own family, having learned so much from going through death of my father with dementia, which was so hard because I really didn't know what questions to ask my father. And by the time I did, it was too late because he wasn't really capable of answering. So now I've written some instructions for my family. You know, if I can't recognize them and can't eat a baguette and can't go to the bathroom by myself and I get a virus, I want you guys to let that virus progress. And I don't want to be treated for it, and I don't want to be sent to the hospital. Those kind of specific instructions are really important, and even an advance directive doesn't really ask us to do that. So I wish I had known that we really do have a role in designing the way that we go out.
BJ, what's your Nobody Told Me lesson?
Well, we've said a few of them. I guess for me, there's a couple. Like one is nobody told me that death is part of life. I kind of grew up with a couple of things that, in retrospect, I wish I had changed. I wish I had known that death and life were one and the same, that you don't get one without the other, that one was not the antithesis of the other, that they're totally linked. Because I think we sadly orphan death and we pay the price, like we talked. So that's the conceptual piece. It reminds me of I really wish someone had also told me that it's not humans or man versus nature. That wish someone had made it clear that human nature is nature. That's related. But then I think a more tactically, my answer would be nobody tells you that you may need to interrupt the healthcare system. I mean, I think a lot of us just assume that we do all we can to live and then we can't do anything more, we die. And that's just how it goes. And the truth is technology is advanced where we can prop up a body, physical life, practically indefinitely. And at some point, most of us are going to have to actually intervene in the momentum of the healthcare system. You're going to have to actually say no to that next treatment if you want a peaceful death. That's counterintuitive, and I think that's a big reason why we wrote this book. You can't just leave it up to Mother Nature in the ways you used to be able to if you ever could. That we have systems now that you actually have to interrupt if you hope to get off the planet in peace.
And tell us more about where people can find the book and communicate with you guys on social media.
Well, we have a website for the book, and it's the acronym of the book, abgtte.com. And there you'll find all of our events, and actually you can download an excerpt from the book so you can read that. We are also both on Twitter, BJ and I, at Shoshana Berger and at BJ Miller MD, and we have a Facebook page for the book as well. It's the title of the book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, and it's a group where we can just talk amongst each other about what's the topics that are brought up in the book.
Wow, that sounds great. That sounds great. Well, we thank you both so much for joining us. Our thanks to Dr. B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger, who are the co-authors of the book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.